Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bénédicte de Montlaur, and I'm the President and CEO of World Monuments Fund, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you for our 2023 Paul Mellon Lecture on Cultural Heritage and Mass Atrocities, co-presented with the Paul Getty Trust. Tomorrow, we will be commemorating the very tragic anniversary of the war in Ukraine, and I think all of us here were shocked at the violence of this attack. And we were also very quickly impressed by all those people who took so many risks, not only to defend their territory, but to defend their heritage, their art. They gathered, they took out the paintings from their museums, they put sandbags around their statues. And I think it's really a tribute of how important heritage is. We take it for granted, but when we see what happens in times of crisis, and we are seeing it again in Syria and Turkey, we see what is the value of the heritage that we all care for. So as many of you know, because I see many of our trustees and international council members here, our mission at World Monuments Fund is to work with local communities around the world to safeguard irreplaceable heritage. So obviously, when the war started in Ukraine, we decided to take action immediately. So we coordinated with many partners, including UNESCO, who is well represented here tonight, but also with our local partners on the ground. We raised funds, and we immediately recruited someone in Ukraine to help heritage professionals there. So we digitized archive, we sent fire extinguishers to wooden churches, and we participated in damage assessment mission to prepare the ground for future rehabilitation projects. And all of this was done thanks to our Ukraine Heritage Response Fund that many people contributed to, so some of you are here tonight, and I want to thank you. Unfortunately, it is not the first time that the international community witnesses events where heritage is targeted. We all felt the impact of the attacks on the Buddhas of Bamiyan in 2001, or what happened in Palmyra in Syria. Those events erase some of humanity's greatest treasures. And that's why we thought that this book, published by Getty just last fall, Cultural Heritage and Mass Atrocities, was so timely. It reminds us not to be complacent with heritage, because not only it's not immortal, that some could think, but sometimes it is a prime target for people trying to target the history and identity of other people. This publication is also a call to action to strengthen the tools we have to protect heritage, including through one concept that is a responsibility to protect, that we're going to talk more tonight about. So we could not think of a more timely topic for our annual lecture than this one of cultural heritage and mass atrocities, and we wanted to partner with Getty, which has been a long-time partner in crime of World Monuments Fund. We've done many projects together. We've worked on Arches, which is a great digital project. We worked on modernism initiatives, and so it was just a natural thing to partner tonight on this event. So it's a great pleasure to welcome such illustrious speakers. So Catherine Fleming is going to introduce at length James Cuno, so I won't do that, but I'm just very happy to welcome him as our keynote speaker. He will be joined for our panel discussion by Thomas Weiss, who is James' co-editor of the book, the Presidential Professor of Political Science at CUNY Graduate Center and former co-chair of the Cultural Heritage and At-Risk Project. Irina Bokova, who is the former Director-General of UNESCO and patron of the International Science Council, and Lazare Eloundou Assomo, who is the director of the UNESCO World Heritage Center. Both of them are contributors to this book. The Paul Mellon Lecture is supported by the Paul Mellon Education Fund, created in 2003 through a generous gift to WMF from the estate of Paul Mellon. For decades, the estate's executor was Frederick Terry, who passed away last month. So we just wanted to remind him, because he's been so influential to support our work at World Monuments Fund. So now I would like to invite Catherine Fleming, the President and Chief Executive Officer at the Paul Getty Trust, to say a few words. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I know that our keynote speaker of the evening, James Cuno, will have been horrified to have just heard Bénédicte say that my job is to introduce him at length. Because the first thing that you need to know about him, if you don't know it already, is that he is a tremendously modest person, completely at odds with the scope of his professional bio, which I am, despite his protestations, going to share with you in a moment. In fact, just before this event, I was speaking with Jim, and I said, is there anything specific you'd like me to say? He said, "You may say my name." And then, upon reflection, he said, "You can just say Jim." So despite the fact that in pretty much any other context, I would wish out of respect and courtesy to follow his instructions, in this one I am going to set them aside and let you know, of course, what you know already, namely that James Cuno is a looming figure in art history, curation, scholarship, cultural leadership. He has served in just about every conceivable major museum leadership position or cultural leadership position in this country. He's been the CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust. He's also the former president or director or CEO, choose the title that you want, at the Art Institute of Chicago, at the Courtauld Institute of Art, at the Harvard University Art Museums, at Dartmouth's Hood Museum of Art, at UCLA's Grunwald Center for the Graphic Arts. The list is truly staggering. He took his undergraduate degree from Willamette University in 1973, an institution that he currently serves as a trustee. He did an MA in art history at the University of Oregon, and then both MA and PhDs in fine arts in the history of art at Harvard University. He's also taught at Vassar, UCLA, Dartmouth, Harvard. Don't worry, Jim, it will end soon. He's lectured and written extensively about not just museums and the history of art, but also very significantly, as he'll be sharing with us tonight, about cultural and public policy. He's been very, very influential in those areas. Since 2003, he's published 3 books with Princeton University Press, all of them interrogative. Whose Muse? Art Museums and the Public's Trust. Who Owns Antiquity? Museums and the Battle Over Our Ancient Heritage, and Whose Culture? The Promise of Museums and the Debate Over Antiquities. And then another one with the University of Chicago Press, more assertively titled Museums Matter, in praise of the encyclopedic museum, something for which Jim has also been a very, very articulate and important spokesperson. I want to end, though, on a personal note. It is rare that someone has the opportunity publicly not simply to introduce their predecessor, but also to thank them. I took over from Jim at the J. Paul Getty Trust at the beginning of August and stepped into a world that is remarkably well run, where people seem, in fact, I say this with a little anxiety, to miss my predecessor. People constantly say to me, "He is such a wonderful guy," and I think they're giving me a hint about how it is that I ought to try to behave, and indeed there are many ways in which I hope to be able to emulate Jim in my term, but I will not be able to emulate him in the tremendous scholarly accomplishments that he has brought to us and that he will share with us this evening. Thank you so much for being here with us. Jim.
I have sciatica. That's what this is all about. For anyone who's ever had it, it's miserable. But I'll put this here just in case I need it. Well, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Bénédicte, for that kind, generous introduction. It's only partially true, and I'll leave it to you to determine which part is true. Could I have the next slide? I think we. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Bénédicte and Catherine. It's an honor to have been invited to deliver the 2023 Paul Mellon Lecture before such an august gathering of scholars and supporters of the World's Monument Fund. That both the J. Paul Getty Trust and the World Monuments Fund share a common ambition to safeguard the world's most treasured museums is a commitment of the highest order. Thank you again. I got the next one, please. No, I guess we'll leave that one on. No, yeah, go back, sorry. Okay. So I will dedicate my remarks this evening to the subject of cultural heritage and mass atrocities, a topic that Getty has been pursuing with earnest and vigor since 2016, and about which it recently published a book of the same title, co-edited by myself and Tom Weiss, who's here with us this evening, a presidential professor of political science at the CUNY Graduate Center. Now, much of our work began at a meeting of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the British Academy in London. We were compelled by the purposeful at that time by the purposeful destruction of the cultural heritage in Syria and Iraq, and the by then recent conviction of, next please slide, of Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi by the International Criminal Court for the war crimes of attacking historic and religious buildings in Timbuktu. 3 months later, in March 2017, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2347, which condemned the, quote, unlawful destruction of cultural heritage and the looting and smuggling of cultural property in the event of armed conflicts, notably by terrorist groups and the attempts to deny historical roots and cultural diversity in this context as a means of fueling and exacerbating conflict and hamper post-conflict national reconciliation. The resolution gave formal international attention to the protection of cultural heritage and to its links to cultural cleansing. Now, inspired by this example, Tom and I convened practitioners of different specialities and experiences over 3 days to discuss a range of topics and approaches to the subject. The result is a book of 32 essays on subjects ranging from China and the Uyghurs to Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Iraq, Yemen, Mali, and Guatemala, written by historians, philosophers, international legal scholars, policymakers, museum leaders, human rights advocates, and one fiercely dedicated pediatrician. The next slide, please. Leading our effort was Irina Bokova, who you'll hear more from this evening, Director-General at the time of UNESCO from 2009 to 2017, and author of the preface to our book. There she documented her personal experience of cultural cleansing, including, in her words, the pain, suffering, and devastating effect of the destruction of ancient heritage on local communities, and concluding with, when cultural heritage is destroyed anywhere in the world, we are all diminished, whether it's from another region, another period, another culture, or another religion. Preserving diverse cultural heritage, and particularly the concept of world heritage, is one of the most positive, visionary, and transformative ideas that has emerged in the last century, said Irina, and she's right. Understanding and preventing the destruction of cultural heritage is a serious proposition, one we offer up in book form in print and online, downloadable free of charge, chapter by chapter, and one that Tom and I and all of our partners on this project are grateful for the opportunity to share with you this evening. And the next slide, please. As you can see here, featured on our book's cover are the images of the Great Mosque of Aleppo in the Al-Jaloum district of the ancient city of Aleppo, a World Heritage Site. The first, that is on top, shows a young family playing in a large marbled courtyard, a mother with her children walking peacefully within it, and young men obluding themselves at one of two fountains. The second image, the one below, was taken perhaps as an photograph taken perhaps 6 months later. It shows the after effects of the bombing of the mosque on October 13th, 2012, by armed groups of the Free Syrian Army. The mosque's complex served as a key battleground throughout the war, with fighters against the government's regime continuously laying siege to the site. As you can see in the lower image, many of the mosque's arcades were covered with wreckage. Walls were punctured, parts were broken down, ornamentation was stolen, and the mosque's celebrated minaret was bombarded to the ground. Both the government and the anti-government forces traded blame for attacking the mosque. With Russian air power and the Iranian technical advisors, the regime drove the rebels out of Aleppo in late 2016 and retook the city. And the population was too exhausted and impoverished by years of war to stage another uprising. Responses to assaults on the Great Mosque were fierce and immediate. As reported by Patrick MacDonald in the Los Angeles Times, Heyman Refi, a 61-year-old Aleppo resident, stood with her 2 daughters in the war-pulverized city and center of Aleppo and explained, "Each time we come here, it feels worse," she said. Another visitor to the site, Mohammed Marsi, stood with his son, among the ruins of the mosque, shaking his head and sighing, "The destruction for the whole country is indescribable, just like what happened to the mosque. If you know the mosque before the damage you saw it now, it's like someone who has lost a child or part of his body." One of the authors of our book, Francesco Banderin, an architect and urban planner and senior advisor of the International Center for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Heritage, emphasized the effects of the impact of the war on the city's cultural heritage, housing, and infrastructure. In 2011, he noted that Syria was already in poor economic condition following a long global recession and a chronic inability to develop a modern industrial center. Within a few months in 2013, the country's economic condition declined precipitously, with oil resources largely falling into the hands of ISIS and the Kurdish forces, deepening a recession caused by sanctions and devastation. Most of the basic public social services, from health to education and social assistance, lay collapsed. Damage to the physical infrastructure of Syria, Francesco reminds us, was and remains an immense challenge due to the direct impact of war and the loss of control by the authorities over the country's vast archaeological and cultural heritage. Entire urban areas, many of them of great historic value, have been devastated, including all of the major archaeological sites that have been subject to massive illegal excavations aimed at reclaiming archaeological treasures to sell on the black market. 5 years of conflict and its aftermath have left much of Aleppo in rubble, leaving economic reconstruction and development slower than experts had expected, and preventing foreign investment and the transfer of resources to the country. Much of the same could be said of Afghanistan, almost 40 years of intermittent war, from the Soviet-Afghan War of the late 1980s to the emergence of the Taliban in the 1990s, the US invasion and establishment of the Islamic Republic from 2001, and the return of power of the Taliban in 2021. The most dramatic display of cultural violence was the performative destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in March of 2001. Well, no one seemed to panic. That's good to see. That's good. The era of the first Taliban rule from 1996 to 2001 was a particularly low point in Afghanistan's history. Its brutal government committed countless atrocities against its own people while supporting the international terrorist organization Al-Qaeda. The Taliban outlawed most kinds of music, art, and education. Even chess and soccer were forbidden, and women were not allowed to study or work. All of this, as our colleague Kavita Singh of the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi makes clear in our book, were well known to the international community, while the acts that excited the greatest attention to and condemnation of the Taliban from the outside world were acts not directed against the Afghan people directly, but against works of art. In 2001, the Taliban leader Mullah Omar issued a fatwa that called for the destruction of all pre-Islamic statues and sanctuaries within its borders, which he described as shrines of unbelievers, and declared that God Almighty is the only real shrine and all the fake idols should be destroyed. Within weeks, Taliban forces destroyed thousands of artworks, including the great Buddhas of the Bamiyan Valley. The great cluster of the Buddhist monuments, go to the next, please. The great cluster of Buddhist monuments were mostly built in the 6th and 7th centuries when Bamiyan was an important stop on the Silk Road. As a rare oasis in a harsh mountainous terrain, it attracted merchants and missionaries and became a prosperous center for religion and trade. But from the 8th century on, Islam began to supplant Buddhism in the area, and Islam began to replace it as the most important cultural influence in the region. In 2001, the Taliban attacked the statues with guns, anti-aircraft missiles, and tanks. Then the Taliban brought in explosive experts from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. On their advice, workers rappelled down the cliff with jackhammers, blasting holes in the sculptures and packing them with dynamite that was then detonated in timed explosions. An Al Jazeera media network journalist was allowed to film the final stage of the Buddha's destruction, and shortly afterward, a contingent of 20 international journalists was brought in to observe the now empty niches. The destruction of the Buddhas gave the Taliban an opportunity to mock the international community, which led for the saving of the Buddhas. As audiences across the globe expressed horror at their destruction, the Taliban defended their actions by claiming that they were horrified in turn at a world that would offer to spend millions of dollars salvaging artworks while intensifying sanctions that denied essential supplies and threatened Afghan lives. What was under attack was not the literal worship of religious idols, but their venerations as cultural icons. In other words, their destruction was a performance designed for the age of the internet, whose audience was neither divine nor local, but global. Only now have the Taliban returned 21 years after their ouster by US troops and with the imposition of Islamic law and its Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Violence and Vice. Another of our colleagues, Gil Stein from the University of Chicago, echoed Kavita's analysis of the Taliban in his essay on performative ideology and the war on heritage in Iraq and among ISIS. Have the next, please. He makes a case in three parts. First, the violent expansion of the caliphate of Daesh in Iraq, also known as ISIS, derives from the group's religious ideology of extremist jihadi Salafism and a strand of Sunni Muslim theology. Second, he shows how Daesh's political and religious violence against people and iconoclastic attacks on heritage monuments were publicized in a dangerous new paradigm of internet performative destruction. And third, he examines the human and cultural targets of Daesh's genocidal actions to emphasize that most of the heritage of cultural targets were shrines sacred to rival Muslim groups rather than ancient or pre-Islamic sites. He concludes his arguments by noting that Daesh's genocidal actions were simply the latest and best publicized examples of a deep historical pattern in which the erasure of culture is a necessary accompaniment to the eradication of people. Tragedies are endless. One example, we have the next, please. In the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, of which the Wall Street Journal reported nearly 4,000 civilian casualties, 1,400 deaths in all, and over 4.5 million refugees, and just as many, if not more, internally displaced Ukrainians. Then 4 months later, it was reported that the Russian retreat from Kherson revealed systemic attacks on the expressions of Ukrainian culture. Thousands of works of art were stolen from the art museum. The director of the city's Philharmonic was killed, and public statues were pulled from their pedestals. The looting is said to have been the part of the wider Russian effort to destroy any Ukrainian identity that distinguishes the country from Russia. And just last month, the New York Times identified about 180 cultural sites as having sustained structural damage and requiring at least partial reconstruction, with 77 cases of cultural buildings, collections, and objects having been destroyed. Anna Melkina, a journalist from Mariupol, said of the attacks on Ukrainian cultural heritage, it's not just the war for the monuments, it's a war for the future, for consciousness, for the right to teach children in a truthful way, a reference to the extensive damage done in schools, libraries. She concluded by saying, on the one hand, it really hurts to watch, but on the other hand, it is absolute belief, the inner awareness that we will restore everything. I could go on. The situation is obvious, and it takes us back to where we started with Irina, who in September 2015 issued a statement addressing the protection of victims of ethnic and religious violence in the Middle East, pointing to mass atrocities and redoubling her criticism of cultural tolerance by saying, all this shows that the humanitarian crisis cannot be separated from cultural cleansing, for these are part of the same strategic imperative and must stand at the heart of the efforts of all peace building. The cultural heritage and diversity of the region, and she was speaking this now of Syria and Iraq, she said, must be safeguarded for future peace as part of our identity for all humanity. So, Bénédicte and Catherine, thank you again for your invitation to speak this evening. It's been a great honor to deliver the World Monument Fund's 2023 Paul Mellon Lecture, and now we'll gather everyone here on the stage. Not everyone, but all those who are here. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much, Jim, for setting the context and explaining to us the whole genesis of this book and its main theories. And now we are very happy to be joined by by your co-editor, Tom Weiss, and some of the main contributors to this book. And so maybe, because you've been mentioned many times, I will start with you, Irina. And so you coined this term cultural cleansing. I think today it's a bit more obvious because we've seen those examples that were mentioned tonight by Jim. But can you tell us a bit more about the genesis of this term and its effectiveness?
Thank you very much, Bénédicte, and congratulations, Jim, also Tom, because I think this publication is so timely. It just brings me a little bit back when the team was convened for a 3-day brainstorming, the first one about the book. And if Jim remembers, I started my introduction to the discussion expressing my concern that it was in 2018, I think, or 19, because already Daesh was pushed away and there was a lot of cognizance about it. And I expressed my concern that maybe interest towards protection of heritage and conflict will be just diminished and disappear. And how naively now I see that indeed this book with the war in Ukraine, of course, is so important and so timely. So you asked me about the term of cultural cleansing. I know we had a debate with Tom, and I'm sure that he will follow on that. It is not, of course, a strictly legal term. But I mention it probably a bit out of emotion when I went for the first time in Iraq after Mosul was occupied, when they showed on the YouTube the destruction of the Mosul Museum with sledgehammers and statues falling down. I have to say, until this very day, I did not watch till the end. It was so horrible what I was seeing. I remember when one of my advisors from the office took me away and said, come, Director-General, something is happening there. And the moment I said, I have to go to Iraq to see what is happening. So I went there, and I visited not only the museum in Iraq, it was not open as yet. I met the representative of minorities of Iraq, the Christians, the Shebaks, the Turkmens, all the others, and I had the feeling that I'm meeting history of humanity because all of them represent this diversity that we know came from the Middle East. And then I went to visit one of the camps, the refugee camps there. And when I saw all this horrible, and I saw the distress of these people, the pain that they were seeing, their culture, their history being erased, or at least there were attempts to erase, and just this phrase came to me. And I was talking to journalists, and I said, what I see is indeed the cultural cleansing. Now, I was happy that it was taken by the executive board of UNESCO. They introduced it in documents because I think it represents and it mobilizes people around the thinking of the link between heritage and people, between history also and diversity and people. And it, in my view, represents all by it once again. Tom, I know that probably you will be speaking about that, the Genocide Convention and others. There has been long debates about it, but I think it represents a true picture of what extremists in those times wanted indeed to achieve in the Middle East.
So thank you. I think now all of us want to hear from you, Tom. What was your problem with the concept of cultural cleansing?
Well, thanks, Bénédicte. But before I respond to your question, I just wanted to build on what Catherine said and throw a few flowers in Jim's direction. And this is not just for the benefit of your daughter, but for other people in the audience. We began this trip 6-7 years ago, and it's been a real pleasure. Catherine said modest. I would say, to use a technical term, unpuffed up. And it's been a pleasure for me. And as somebody who's been in the academy for 50 years, you can imagine that I may have run into a prima donna or two. Catherine, maybe you'll support that. But he's really the opposite of that. And what was fun for this book was that we had complementary skills. And Jim cared deeply about the quality of the prose. He also cared deeply about getting the arguments right, which is not easy with 33 chapters to corral herding cats. But in order to have a book that has something besides random thoughts between two handsome covers, we did a lot of work together. And so thanks for being a congenial as well as knowledgeable sidekick. Back to the question. This cultural cleansing is not a legal concept. And with apologies to the lawyers in the audience, I think that's a strength. None of the 10 distinguished lawyers who contributed to the book thought that we needed any more public international law. There's plenty of law. What there is not enough of is any political will to enforce the law. But the power of the concept is like the power of ethnic cleansing, which grew up out of the Balkans crises in the early 1990s, in which large groups of people were purged from territory. And so the evocation, it's such an emotive conflict. And like Potter Stewart's characterization of pornography, we know it when we see it, so we don't actually need any more law. Destruction of property is cultural heritage is a war crime for sure. It's arguably a crime against humanity, and I think we need to act. We don't need any more law. So this book will certainly be one of Jim's legacies, and I wanted to cite correctly. There are several translations. We begin the book, and actually at yesterday's meeting when we were talking with a bunch of UN officials, pointed to the quote from Heinrich Heine, the 19th century German poet, which was seized upon subsequently by Raphael Lemkin when he was putting together the Genocide Convention, probably the hardest piece of international public law. And burning books is not the same as burning bodies, but when one intervenes against mass destruction of churches, and we'd add now mosques and everything else, one arrives just in time to prevent the burning of bodies. Well, obviously, Lemkin had in mind Kristallnacht and the pogrom accompanied by lots of cultural destruction. But he wanted two parts to the Genocide Convention, one of them being what's in the Genocide Convention, biological extermination, but he also wanted cultural genocide to be part and parcel of that convention. That was tossed out for a variety of reasons we can go into later. But ironically, you started with Ukraine, and I'm sure we'll end with Ukraine this evening. Jim and I were finalizing the book at precisely this time a year ago, a few days after the beginning of the Russian invasion. So there's no case study on the Ukraine in the book, but what we'll discuss this evening and you'll see in the newspapers illustrates the entire narrative of the book, of the intimate link between murdering history and murdering people. And so what we've seen in the Ukraine, and not to put too fine a point on it, is the deaths of tens of thousands of people, soldiers, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and, by the way, what UNESCO will document now is about 240 major cultural sites. And what experts have now told us is the largest heist of artifacts and loot since World War II. So ironically, the special military operation to denazify the Ukraine has resulted in probably a comparable performance to the Third Reich in terms of those activities. So while none of this is new, alas, and that's why the World Monument Funds is in business, it seems to me that we have said on numerous occasions, you mentioned R2P, we can come back to that, that what we said after World War II and what we said after Rwanda and several other events is never again, and what we say is never again, once again. And so as I say, I'm not worried about the lack of law. I'm worried about the absence of any political will to do anything. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much. And I think it's at the same time quite interesting to see that the first resolution considering the destruction of cultural heritage as a threat to peace and security only dates back to 2017. And so that's pretty recent. And so I agree with you. Now we have a good international body of law, but it took time to build. And so maybe now I will turn to UNESCO, to our representative. So Lazar, before we talk about UNESCO, I wanted to ask you about your chapter in the book, which is about one of the examples that we didn't mention tonight, which is about Mali and the destruction of the mausoleum there. So you wrote this chapter of the book because you were the representative of UNESCO there. So can you tell us about this example and also about another aspect that we didn't mention tonight, that is the role that heritage can play in post-conflict reconstruction? Because we've talked a lot about heritage being targeted while targeting the people who are targeting their history. But there is also a positive side of the story, which is the role that heritage plays in rebuilding the communities.
No, thank you very much. Let me first also start by saying how really fortunate and I was to be based in Mali in order to help, the situation which was really terrible for the world. And really thank you to Jim and Tom for giving us a space, for giving UNESCO a space to, in this book, to tell the story of how our UNESCO action was done in Mali to safeguard this heritage that was being destroyed. I think reconstruction it's a human story. And this is exactly what everyone was saying. And in Mali, when it was decided to conduct the reconstruction of the mausoleums, I think this came as an evidence. And I think Irina Bokova, who was in Timbuktu first, saw this evidence already in the beginning, and then she came back. I think maybe
you can mention what happened exactly because it's a long time ago.
And that's what, so I like to just to say exactly what happened, because in 2012, the northern part of Mali was occupied by Ansar Dine, the extremist group, and so they invaded the northern part, and then they started destroying part of the important cultural heritage of the city. And this heritage had, of course, Timbuktu is known for its mud architecture, which was composed of, great mosques, some of them dating from the 14th century, because Timbuktu was an intellectual and religious center with a university of more than 25,000 people, coming from all over the world to come and study there. But also the mausoleums. And just to be clear that these mausoleums were not, another elements of religion. These mausoleums were mausoleums simply because the communities that have decided to build them starting from the 13th century were doing it to pay tribute to their ancestors who have been, the great scholars in the city and who have made, the Timbuktu become this intellectual center, of the African Middle Age, if we can say it like that. So the attachment of the communities since the 11th century to their heritage until now was also due to the fact that this heritage was helping them structure their social life, their cultural life, but also, live in harmony, because Timbuktu, it was a place of many communities, not only the Arabs, but also the Songhai, the Tuaregs, and many. They were living in harmony in this place, living in harmony and protecting their heritage, not only the mausoleums, but also their ancient manuscripts. Remember that this is a place where I can say you have the biggest number of manuscripts in a square meter in the world, because they've been producing manuscripts at that time. So when this heritage was destroyed, it was obvious for UNESCO that it has to be rebuilt, because it was not about only rebuilding stones, and I'm using your words, Irina. It was about more than rebuilding stones. It was about, trying to protect people's identity and history. And this is what we did. And the way we did it was to place the communities at the heart of the reconstruction process, meaning that mud architecture and this heritage have been protected for centuries by the people using their own traditional knowledge and practices. So they were the only one who could, help us, rebuild this heritage. And so the first thing that we did is that, of course, we had a number of consultation processes and meetings to try to understand with the local masons how they will be leading the reconstruction of the mausoleums. Not bringing people from elsewhere, international enterprise, construction companies to come and rebuild. It was important that to let the community lead the process, and I'll tell you why. So in this process, it was also important to understand, all the stages. How they were to do it, but to give them, the leadership. Remember that, as I said, it was an intellectual and religious center. So the maintenance for years were led by the religious leaders with the communities. So they were given back this responsibility, and that's what we did. And so in rebuilding the mausoleums, we tried to revive this maintenance, this culture of this traditional logic, which was important, but also to transfer it to the younger generation, because the old masons, they were very old. Some of them were even blind, and they were guiding to try to transfer this knowledge to the younger generation, who had accepted to stay in Timbuktu while, there was nothing to do anymore there. So this reconstruction was done, but at the end of the reconstruction, it was not only to rebuild the mausoleums. Remember that it was important, the sacredness of these mausoleums. So we even went far, and this is because we had to understand what the community wanted. They wanted to give back the sacredness to these mausoleums. So we had to organize a consecration ceremony of the mausoleum. And this consecration ceremony had not happened since the 11th century. And so this is to let you know this was so important, because that's how they would at least, retake back their real mausoleums. And that was, of course, to look at the sustainability and the fact that, it will really be a full reconstruction, not just the rebuilding of mausoleums. And it was really important. And to come back to your second question, the reason why we had done that had enabled us, start putting, the first elements of the environment for peace reconstruction in buildings. First thing. The second thing, when we rebuilt the museum, we did not only rebuild the museum belonging to one communities. We made sure that we were rebuilding mausoleums representing each of the communities, so that at least all of them will really have the sense of coming back to the place. And that was very important. And because of this, you know, this reconstruction contributed to the post-conflict reconstruction and to the post-conflict building process. And I think, and up to date, and I think it has created this new environment where people, you know, are trying really to get back to this trauma, to try to recover from this terrible moment that they spent with the destruction of their cultural heritage.
Thank you, Lazar, because I think it's a very important message also tonight to say that, yes, heritage is a target in times of conflict, but after conflict, it can help the community and can be a means for resilience and hope. And this is something that we've been doing for a very long time. We participated with UNESCO in the rebuilding of Montlaur. Of course, World Monuments Fund has been very involved in Cambodia for over 30 years after the fall of the Khmer Rouge. I always translate, and for once it's in French, so I should take advantage. And most recently, we saw pictures here of the destruction of the Mosul Museum. And World Monuments Fund is participating in the effort with the Smithsonian, Alif, and the Louvre for the rehabilitation of the Mosul Museum, not only because it is stones, but because we think it's essential for rebuilding the community in Mosul and rehabilitating their identity. Yeah.
May I just jump in, because I think it's underlying much of what Lazar told us, is the fact that we don't necessarily have to just focus on the mausoleums and on the Mostar Bridge and on Bamiyan, all of the spectacular sites that constitute World Heritage. We asked the authors, and I think it's very important, whether it's rebuilding either peace or the monuments, to pay attention to everyday structures, not just the big monuments, the ones we take photographs of in the media. Is the people in these places are really concerned about mud brick mosques, not just the Aleppo mosque. They're concerned with, you know, Christian cemeteries in Syria, etc. So we really should keep that in mind, front and center.
Thank you for saying that, because just one, like in our mission we have irreplaceable heritage, and people ask us, what is irreplaceable heritage? And what we say is that it's irreplaceable heritage to this community. It doesn't mean World Heritage, and we'll come to World Heritage, but for instance, in what we are rehabilitating in Iraq, you have some Yazidi shrines that are not on the World Heritage list, but that are so important for these communities that has been targeted by genocide. But yes, Irina.
No, I just want to pick up of what Lazar and Tom mentioned. I think the case of Mali is important for several aspects. First, of course, is the community, and we don't speak much about intangible heritage, but we have to know that it's there. You cannot sometimes make a very strong distinction, and I think the mausoleums is such a case in point. Of course, it's the bricks, the buildings, but it's also the attachment of the local people, the stories, the history, what is transmitted from one generation to another. And that is why it's very interesting from that point of view. For the first time, the Security Council entrusted the peacekeeping mission for Mali to integrate the protection of heritage, including intangible heritage. And it's a very interesting story that in Mali, it is the oldest oral democratic constitution in the world. It's oral, it's not written, but it has been Maden, it's called Maden. It has been passed from one generation to another. And this also was taken, there was a special unit within the peacekeeping mission that was dedicated to protection of heritage, including intangible heritage. This is the way for these people, for the communities, to regain, once again, their history and the way they resolve conflict and the way they establish their own kind of a governance. And of course, the second is what Jim showed here on one of the photos, was the first convicted for the destruction of heritage, Al-Mahdi, where we at UNESCO worked with the International Criminal Court, the chief prosecution. It was for the first time, everybody was saying maybe this will not happen because it has never happened, but we put the two teams together of legal experts and others, and even at that time my deputy for culture, part of our team, Francesco Bandarin, you quoted him, he went to The Hague, he testified, and finally I think it was important because the message of impunity is very important in such cases.
Yeah, and I think now we are turning to action. And this is one example of action, showing the world that if you do this kind of thing, you're not going to not be punished. It's really important. This is what happened with this first ICC indiction. Because I want to take advantage that Lazar is here from Paris, especially for this lecture and also for a few meetings. So just recently, because we all have our mind around Ukraine, so recently you added Odessa on the list of heritage in danger. And so talking about action, what does that mean exactly and what does that do?
No, this is it's very important. Remember that, I mean, just to share with everyone that on the very first day of the war in Ukraine, immediately, I mean, UNESCO, was active to help the Ukrainian professionals, active to assist the Ukrainian government to organize itself, to try to advocate on the importance of its cultural heritage, because Ukraine has 7 World Heritage and many numerous cultural heritage and natural heritage sites across the world. And this has been one of the, I'll say, most important action that Audrey Azoulay, as the Director-General, has put as the priority. And in fact, with the war going, we have been monitoring the damages. And Tom was saying it, today we have been able to ascertain 241 damages. It doesn't mean that there is not much more, but it simply shows that every 3 days, 2 monuments are destroyed. When you do the calculation, every 3 days, 2 monuments, and this is a massive one. And so the reason why it was important to put Odessa on the World Heritage list was, of course, to say that when a site is of outstanding universal importance for the world should come together to protect it. And placing Odessa on the World Heritage list raises its profile against any destruction, because if Odessa tomorrow is intentionally destroyed, I think it's not going to let people quiet. I think this is, and so this inscription on the World Heritage list, definitely it's another level of protection of the city of Odessa. And I think it was a great achievement that was done recently.
So thank you, Lazar. And now we'll turn back to you, Jim, because I think one of the great points of the book is just about that, about action, because I feel many of us, we are watching what's happening in Ukraine. We are trying to help heritage professionals as much as we can. But, let's say if Odessa gets destructed or is threatened, what can we do? And in your book, you talk a lot about the concept of responsibility to protect, which was coined more for protection of civilians in time of conflict. And I will let you explain the whole concept if you want. But there are like 3 different aspects of this, but it's mainly known for as the obligation of the international community to intervene in a country when the civilians are at risk. So how does that impact and give tools to protect cultural heritage in time of conflict?
It gives political sanction to the actions that the fellows are undertaking to protect. In the sequence of powerful positions of this. and so that's a principal matter of it. I mean, Tom's really the person to talk to about this because he was there at the beginning in a sense, and he's the one who's written most articulately about it. But to wrap in around something this that Irina should also be talking about it for us is the concept of, there's cause and effect that it's very difficult to understand and to identify that. Tom was mentioning that already, how difficult it is with that's why there's not much case law associated with it because of that. But what really is equally as important in this is how it functions as these destructions of cultural heritage give images to and justify and the understanding of the criticism of the cultural cleansing in the form of forewarnings of something that's going to happen. If it's happening now here, it's going to happen now there, and it's going to happen now after that. So it's a sense of you don't have to have proof that something is really, that has the effect of destruction, but you have to have, you can realize that there's going to be forewarnings of the negatives.
These citations, this quote about first they burn books and then they burn bodies, and but yeah. So Tom, do you want to elaborate because now you were?
Yes, I still have scars on my back from being the director of research for the commission that hatched the idea of R2P. What's important when we conceive this book is that there's a sort of marriage of Jim's friends and my friends in terms of the museum people, the curators, the cultural heritage folks, and then, shall we say, a cottage industry of social scientists, lawyers, and others. And previously, these are two groups of people who didn't actually end up in the same room very frequently. But what's happened, I think, in particular over the last 10 years, is the necessarily coming together of these two communities, because the folks who look at cultural heritage as important in and of itself and important to protect in and of itself, that's obviously true. But the dimensions for humanitarians, the dimensions for international peace and security are really important. So in trying to decide what to do, we tried to put these groups together. And we started off with this notion of, do we need an additional element of the responsibility to protect, which says that if there's genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing, there's a responsibility to act. It shifted the perspective toward what you indicated as important, Lazar. That is, it's not the right to humanitarian intervention. It's not the right of outsiders to intervene. It's actually the right of local populations and vulnerable populations to protection and assistance, and then the responsibility of the rest of us, the international community of states and World Monuments Fund and everybody else, to do what's possible to come to the rescue. And we started out thinking that there was a distinction, and the book, I think, now argues fairly clearly that it's very difficult to separate the murder of history and the murder of human beings. And as part of that equation, if you wish, one needs to come to grips with understanding the importance of cultural heritage destruction and looting as part of a larger equation that gets lots of others involved. In the book, we try to pull together the heritage folks, the lawyers, the humanitarians, including a pediatrician, and the military folks as well.
Yeah, and I think that's quite revolutionary and also very well done in this book that I'm sure everybody will want to read. You can download it. Now I'm doing the commercial. You can download it thanks to the Getty for free online. But before we conclude, I wanted to see if there were a few questions in the room for our speakers. Yes, please. One second. 'Cause
thank you very much. For me, it truly is an honor to be here tonight, and I would like to say that fate has allowed Lazare to be in Mali at a time when history really taught us about the first word in World Heritage, which is world. And it brought together the notion that centrality is not exactly where we think it should be. So I think that many Africans and many people around the world owe a debt of gratitude to Lazare and to UNESCO and to the work that Ms. Bokova did, because it became extremely important to discover Timbuktu. And it is not only about the world, it's about the whole world. So between Timbuktu and Odessa, we face the same kind of anguish. And in order to somehow preempt people who are in power to destroy World Heritage sites, I think that there is more that we can do. Having served as spokesperson for several presidents of the General Assembly, I remember that what leaders and what member states fear the most is to be named and shamed. So I would like to suggest that even though, and I agree that action is lacking, we may not have all the means simply because the way the Security Council is built, even though action is lacking, still we can, I believe, bring the notion of destroying World Heritage sites to a higher level of naming and shaming with more advocacy. For instance, in the whole notion of responsibility to protect or to prevent genocide, which is actually the office where I last worked before retiring from the United Nations, I realized that some countries were very much afraid of being named and shamed. And if there is ever one aspect in the life of member states that they fear most, is to be called genociders or to be named as either leader or country who have perpetrated or who are about to perpetrate a genocide. So I would like to suggest that maybe not only putting emphasis on the notion of people, flesh and bones, but also taking the sites, as Lazare was explaining, not only rebuilding what has been destroyed, but also putting back together people's lives, we can bring at a higher level in all the notions that are discussed in the responsibility to protect philosophy, we can tell leaders that if you do this, if you send your weapons, you send your bombs, you send your missiles, not only against human beings, but also against buildings, you will be named and shamed as somebody who is actually perpetrating or trying to perpetrate a genocide, because you may not be. Today, we realize that, and Lazare explained it well, we cannot dissociate, we cannot separate the human being from the buildings, because as somebody said in a beautiful book, even the ashes burn. Human beings burn faster. The ashes may take longer, but it may be more difficult to reconstruct. So again, a debt of gratitude to UNESCO, to Madame Bokova, to Lazare, to all the work that we have done. Between Odessa and Timbuktu, we go through the same anguish. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, and this is really what underlies our work, is that it's not the heritage of Mali or of Ukraine, it's our world heritage. Any question? Yes?
Hello, my name is Chris Parnagian. I have great respect for the World Monuments Fund, I should say, and also for the Getty. So thank you so much for pulling together such a great panel discussion. I'm here in my individual capacity, but I'm also counsel to Save Armenian Monuments, which is under the auspices of the Eastern Prelacy of the Armenian Church. And I know that going back till time immemorial until today, there's been a lot of bad conduct in this world. And I know that there's been a lot of cultural erasure against many people. So it's a formidable task for Dr. Weiss and Dr. Cuno to document everything. But you have 32 excellent chapters in this book, and there's not one chapter on what the Azerbaijanis are doing today to the Armenians. So my request, my hope, is that if there's a second edition, that comes out soon, that we could give some thought to adding a chapter to what's happening in that part of the Caucasus, because just recently, within the last 20 years, forget about the recent war, but just over the last 20 years, in the enclave of Nakhichevan, which is historically Armenian, as you know, 22,000 tombstones were demolished, 6,000 stone crosses were demolished, 89 churches were demolished, based on credible information that I'm aware of. So that's my 2 dram, that's cents in Armenian, 2 cents, and I hope you take that under consideration.
So Jim, Tom, do you want to comment?
On the second edition, I'm still, well, the selection of cases is always somewhat unscientific. And we also don't have a case on the Balkans because we didn't quite know how to put that in, and we have a long-standing case on Guatemala, which people said, why'd you put that in there? Because there was a person who had worked on that, and we thought it had different lessons from the ones that are there. I don't dispute your contention that one could do a case on that, and in particular, to go back to the previous point, that these are tombstones. This is not Palmyra. This is not the mosque in Aleppo, but they're very important to the people in those communities. So.
Let him answer the non-question, and then we'll continue.
So anyway, we could add another 15 cases. It's already 700 pages long, so that's probably not on. I think what's important, if we can come back to the Ukraine, which is where you started this, it's much clearer in the Ukraine than in actually some of the other cases. The conscious link between the strategy of war pursued by Moscow that incorporates cultural cleansing, cultural genocide, the destruction of important cultural heritage, because supposedly Ukraine doesn't exist as an independent place. Nationhood is a fiction that needs to be belittled. And the entire strategy, in addition to annihilating people, is also based on getting rid of these traces of what clearly is a preposterous contention that Ukraine is not a separate country. So we would do a case on the Ukraine and probably also Azerbaijan.
So thank you, and I think unfortunately there are indeed several cases that need to be added because heritage is targeted in many places. So with that, I'm very sorry. I think we've run out of time, but we can talk with you after. But I think we have to finish this lecture. I want to thank, of course, Jim for this wonderful lecture, and mainly also for the book. As well as Tom Weiss, his co-editors, and all the contributors. I wish we could have invited the 32 contributors, but well, we would have run really out of time. And so I want also to thank the Getty for partnering with us on our annual lecture. It's really a pleasure to be doing that, especially with you, Catherine. So wonderful, thank you. I want to thank all our trustees, members who are here and supporting our work. I think you're even more convinced after tonight's lecture on the importance of what all organizations are doing for cultural heritage, not only World Monuments Fund, but also the Getty, UNESCO, and we wish there were many others because the needs are immense. I want to thank my staff, obviously, at World Monuments Fund and the staff of the Getty. It's been a wonderful cooperation, completely seamless. So thank you, everyone, and stay tuned. We have many people online as well. Thank you for participating, and yeah, I hope to see you soon for further activities and action to protect heritage. Thank you.